So welcome everybody to the Fugitive Words seminar of the India's Politics and its Vernaculars project. Today we're delighted to have Jelle Wouters, who is a member of the project team. He is a scholar of politics in Northeastern India. He is an anthropologist who's done extensive ethnographic and historical research in Nagaland. He is the author of a very excellent book called In the Shadows of Naga Insurgency, which I highly recommend, and also the editor of Vernacular Politics in Northeastern India, which is forthcoming shortly and which I've had the opportunity to read before its emergence. So watch this space and welcome, Jelle.
Thank you everyone for joining today. I've been reading Anastasia, Dilip, Vitebsky, Lisa Bjorkman, and Melinda and many others for many years actually. And your work has greatly influenced mine, and I'm very grateful to Anastasia for inviting me to be part of this forum and for being able to present some of my work and thoughts here. Are my slides visible, Anastasia? They are, right? Okay. So my ethnographic work is based on Nagaland in Northeast India, where I carried out 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork. My work is also informed by my longer dwelling in the region for close to a decade, mostly in Shillong, where I pursued my PhD at the Northeastern Hill University, as well as 3 years in Sikkim, where I had my first appointment in the Department of Anthropology of Sikkim Central University, before moving to the Royal University of Bhutan in 2015. And I will be focusing today, obviously, on Highland, Northeast India. Perhaps nowhere in India is contemporary politics and visions of the political as diverse, animated, uncontainable, and poorly understood as in Northeast India. All across this region and involving its 200-odd communities, the political is a dominating feature of the social landscape. It locally unfolds as a complex, often volatile field of material desires, existential anxieties, social practices, moral evaluations, ontological clashes, and imaginative future visions that everywhere overflow the shores of a politics defined in a narrow institutional sense. Even a cursory look at Indian round-the-clock news channels or a glance at national newspapers reveal that the way Northeastern Indians go about their political lives befuddles even the most astute mainland political pundits and theorists. They readily declare the Northeast as different and other than Indian, and they struggle to make sense out of the seemingly sudden ethnic flares and decades-old political conflicts that refuse to die out, the proliferation of ethno-nationalist projects every other hill and valley, and claims and contests over indigenous recognition and rights. What confuses many of them further is the distinct ethnicization of local identities, the fetishization of putatively ancient customary laws, the political potency of millenarian prophecies of various kinds, a public sphere suffused with tribal bodies, and the occasional outburst of gruesome ethnic violence and uncontrollable tribalism. To them, as to many scholars of South Asia, Northeast Indian politics, so to speak, often stays an enigma, a puzzle seemingly impossible to solve. In this context, what I propose to do today is to briefly discuss 3 major narratives of democracy's life in Northeast India, and then focus on one of them. The first narrative is one of resistance and protest. Here, not some kind of traditionalist rejection of an alien political system that came to compete with the leverages of chiefs, village councils, elders, and community governance writ large, but resistance against what participation in elections communicate, allegiance, that is, to the Indian state. The Nagas, then represented by the Naga National Council, were the first to refuse democratic participation. As part of their struggle for Naga independence, they successfully boycotted India's first 2 general elections in 1952 and 1957. Other underground and revolutionary groups in the region, particularly in Manipur, Assam, and Meghalaya, too have called election boycotts at different times and with varying degrees of success, but professing a similar rationale of political refusal. Such election boycotts continue to be omnipresent in the local democratic landscape. Things have changed somewhat, however, and most election boycott calls in the region today are not acts of outright rebellion that communicate a refusal of the Indian state. Instead, they are best read as the staging of protest or as acts of negotiation in relation to particular state policies, miscarriages of justice, or to draw attention to specific political grievances and claims. These are protests with high stakes, as they step at the very heart of the state's legitimacy, the democracy process. Popular election boycotts in Assam, for instance, left several seats to the Indian parliament vacant in the recent past to protest the alleged de facto Indian government policy of admitting and enfranchising quote-unquote foreigners. While in Manipur, the Mera Paibi, the Meitei women organization, called for an election boycott to protest the sustained human rights abuses in the state. And in Nagaland, ever since the 1997 Indo-Naga conflict, Indo-Naga ceasefire, there has been a call or a slogan saying no elections but solution. So this is the first narrative to understand democracy in Highland Northeast India, which is a narrative. The second narrative is one of oppression, subjugation, and violence by the Indian state, coupled with coercion exerted by a range of revolutionary underground. This narrative highlights the aggressive implications of insurgency and counterinsurgency, dense militarization and rebel violence, and draconian extra-constitutional laws into the democratic domain of most, though not all, of the northeastern states. This was the consequence of several communities confronting, at different moments, the Indian state by proclaiming independence, claiming ethno-territorial autonomy and rights, or by agitating, often by violent means, for the redrawing of existing political boundaries and arrangements. What these communities received in return was the red expressed in agonizing violence and in the suspension of the rule of law of the Indian state, which, with the passing of post-colonial time, dispatched ever larger numbers of its military and paramilitary forces to the region. State oppression and counterinsurgency did not result in the waning of so-called underground groups, of which well over 100 continue to exist in the region. Rather than necessarily rejecting the Indian state, most of these groups have inserted themselves as extra layers of local governance, where they also involve, more or less openly, in electoral processes. Political disorder, Chabal and Dallos explain for large parts of Africa, and I quote, should not be constructed as it normally is in classical political analysis merely as a state of dereliction. It should also be seen as a condition which offers opportunities for those who know how to play that system. In Northeast India, many have learned how to play that system, spawning shadowy networks of politicians, rebels, state functionaries, contractors, and others who find power, status, and lucrative returns in the zones of ambiguity between underground and overground constellations of power, between the presence and the suspension of the law. They operate in the black and gray economy of the state and its development resources, where they connect, connive, and compete in elaborate ecologies of corruption, patronage, power, and racketeering. Voters know this, and what is locally called the underground factor has become an intricate part of election talk. This second narrative of democracy's life in the region is therefore one of intrigue that produces a politic that reveals itself, more often than not, as a complex choreography of coercion, collusion, chaos, corruption, criminality, and conflict. These threaten, now and then, here and there, to make a caricature of the basic values democracy in elections claims to represent: freedom, choice, accountability, transparency, and progress. In view of the above two narratives that highlight resistance, protest, violence, and corruption as core components of democracy in elections in Northeast India, one could reasonably expect voter turnouts to be low, even dismally so. The opposite is true, however. Across the region, voters flock to polling booths with turnouts readily pitching above 80 to 90% for most elections. These official statistics are not just significantly higher than the national average, that hovers between 60 to 65, I think a little higher in the previous election, but they cluster several northeastern states at the very top of India's chart of state-wise voter turnouts. There are two general interpretations of high voter turnouts. The first is universalistic and insists that they are evidence of people's acceptance of the political system and their role within it. The second is more India-specific, namely the election as ritual explanation by Banerjee, which says that most Indians perceive the act of voting as a sacred expression of citizenship. Neither theory is convincing in Northeast India. This failure to convince is because of the regular election boycott calls, many insurgencies, routine violence, and overall diminished democracy. And because many Northeasterners distance themselves from and are being distanced by the idea of India. What then explains this apparent electoral effervescence within Northeast India? The answer comes in the form of a third narrative, and the one so far least studied and understood in the region: democracy's vernacularization, and with that, a focus on the social relations that undergird and animate and of course agitate contemporary democratic politics in the region. In what follows, I will offer a case study of the Naga, which is a confederacy of tribes. There are about 40 or more, nobody seems to know for sure, tribes which more or less identify as Naga. So I will identify certain continuities, certain changes, and certain changing continuities between traditional, quote unquote, of course, polities and present day politics. I will argue towards a more contextualized, a more culturally embedded understanding of Nagaland's electoral processes. Sorry, one which renders, okay. So I will look at the way traditional polities and politics have become remapped on the post-independent democratic domain. So when we look at Naga traditional politics and we look at the colonial archive, which is very dense for the Naga, we see that prevailing descriptions about traditional polities are very diverse. There have been Naga chiefs and democrats, nobles and commoners, bodies of elders, powerful chiefs, and the absence of chiefs, sovereign village states and village republics, extreme egalitarianism, clan rivalries, and on the whole, if we delve through the kind of Naga archive, we see that its politics, its polities are represented as a continuum with hereditary autocracy, if not near dictatorship, in the form of kings and chiefs, and radical democracy at its opposite ends. Now, while such terms are obviously simplifications of complex multi-layered Naga political systems, I propose, and at the risk of being accused of overestimating the relationship between culture, traditional polities, and contemporary electoral politics, 4 models. The Ang, which is the king or chieftainship model, the village consensus candidate model, the clan candidate model, and the household model, which I think help to understand how different Naga electorates elect their representatives. These 4 modules, I argue, are best understood as extensions or a remapping of different traditional Naga polities. My data for this presentation are primarily so-called declarations of support, as they appeared in plenty in Nagaland dailies in the months and weeks preceding the 2013 elections. By relying primarily on newspaper declarations for this presentation at least, my evidence is admittedly perhaps more anecdotal than it is methodological, although I concur with Akhil Gupta reasoning that newspaper reports must be understood as cultural text and social historical documents, and can be a great asset for thick description. Before I go into these 4 modules, it must be emphasized that these models are ideal types. Most certainly they are not deterministic, and in reality, they are perhaps as often defied as adhered to. Then again, within the same Naga tribe and constituency, multiple models might compete and intermingle. And well, for the purpose of clarity, I associate each model with one or more particular Naga tribes. This does not suggest that the model applies either exclusively to them or that all units falling under its tribal designation practice it in exactly the same way. The first model, and this is a model regarding how voting decisions are being made, is the Ang or chieftainship model. Ang is a Konyak word for king. So this first model, in prominence among the Konyak Naga and in a somewhat less pronounced manner practiced by the Sema, today they prefer to be called Sumi, Naga is the Ang or chieftainship model. The basic premise of this model is that the traditional leverages of Konyak and Sema aristocrats have, to an extent, been remapped onto the democratic playing field, with traditional rulers now influencing the voting pattern of their commoners. But this does not mean that the political opinion of traditional aristocrats is necessarily definite. It suggests that their political stance tends to preponderate over the majority of quote-unquote ordinary villagers. After the introduction of democracy, a few Konyak kings joined the election fray themselves, so blurring the division between traditional leverages and post-statehood constellation of power. But most kept to their traditional area of jurisdiction, turning themselves from kings into kingmakers. In the past, before their enclosure into the state, Konyak Angs reigned over a village or a cluster of villages, and their powers were hereditary, autocratic, and sacrosanct. In the words of the colonial administrator Hutton, the Ang is a repository of fortune, virtue, or life principle of his village. Hutton continued, and I quote, "In some villages, he is or was so heavily tabooed that he must not touch the ground." On the whole, Angs expected deference from the villagers, as well as parts of their crops and labor. They could exercise sexual rights over the women of the commoner clans, and the village morung, which was the traditional bachelor house common among the Naga, was usually part of the Ang's palace, his residence. Now, with the introduction of formal democracy and the state bureaucracy, the powers of the Angs became somewhat diminished. However, they continue to have a large say in village affairs, and by extension, in who will be elected as the member of the legislative assembly in their constituency. So what happens in Nagaland is that villages, clans, or clusters of villages prior to election day, they publish in a newspaper for who the whole village is going to vote, or for who the whole clan is going to vote. And these are so-called declarations of support. And it is these declarations of support that I will be using here as my data of analysis. So here we see the first one. So in the wake of the state assembly election, this declaration of support from Zankam village, which is a Konyak Naga village, appeared in local newspapers. In it, it stated that the Zankam village citizens unanimously resolved to support and vote for the young and capable NPF. NPF is Naga People's Front, aspirant candidate, and then of course the name of the candidate. This declaration, promising collective vote from the entire village, was signed by the chief Ang, by the traditional king, and countersigned by the local party president. You can see the signature below on this image. Another Konyak Naga village declared in a newspaper that Angs and other kind of village leaders of 3 villages firmly resolved and select a particular candidate as the one they would collectively vote for. The statement was endorsed by the chief Ang Kum chairperson of Chi village, the Ang Kum chairperson of Nengka village, and the chairperson of Koching village, the last one presumably not holding the title of Ang. So what we see here is that traditional kings are resorting to the newspaper to announce the collective voting decisions of their particular villages. Similarly, the Ang of Tizit village published a declaration countersigned by the village council chairperson, announcing that his village had unanimously resolved to support Mr. Konyak, the intending candidate. In yet another Konyak constituency, the Ang of Noksang village declared his support for one candidate and promised that all the 1,329 votes of the 2 villages over which he presided as king would be cast in favor of the Naga People's Front. If the Ang is not the principal actor, he may assume the role of mediator or facilitator, as seemed to have happened in the village of Tangyu, from which this declaration of support was dispatched. And I would like you to focus on the first line. which says that the Council of Tangyu village had called a meeting at the Chief Ang's palace. So at the palace of the traditional king, it was decided, the collective vote of the village was decided. In case of the Semanaga, or the Suminaga, aristocratic families now the state-introduced officers of Gondora. This is a colonial term a colonial position bestowed on a clan of village elder, which was to function as an intermediary between the colonial government and villages, and this position continued during the post-colonial era. According to Hutton, according to the kind of colonial kind of sources that we have, right, the Sumi chiefs were less powerful than the Konyak, but on many other counts they exerted definite rule over the villagers. They were known as the Lord of the Main. So it was under the auspices of the head Gondora, who was belonging to an aristocratic clan, that Sunito Sumi village conducted a general meeting in which it was resolved, and I cite here from this declaration, that we will support solid franchise to the MPF candidate. In a similar vein, it was a Gondora chairperson and the secretary of Unity Village who stated in the newspaper that we, the Sumi Community Council, reaffirms the decision to fully and sincerely support the intending MPF candidate. On the whole, however, it appears that Konyak kings have comparatively larger say in contemporary electoral politics compared to the traditional aristocrats among the Sumi, although obviously context matters a great deal. While the views of traditional aristocrats no longer carry the force they once did, the declarations of support cited here suggest that Angs and chiefs have, in parts, been able to remap their traditional leverages, now playing a prominent role in local electoral processes. Hence, for an aspiring politician in constituency where this model is in vogue, the essence of the matter is to win over the traditional Angs and chiefs, trying to persuade them to use their influence to his support. This brings us to the second module that I would like to discuss today, which is the village consensus candidate model. The village consensus candidate model holds that a village tends to vote as one for a particular candidate. And this figures most prominently among the Auna, although it is also practiced in various villages belonging to other tribes. In this model, the unit of voting is not the individual, but the village. The village collective vote is deliberated at the level of the village council, Putu Munde, and the village apex body called the Senso Mundang, which freely translates as the gathering of all male citizens. A Senso Mundang is only held sporadically, and if such a meeting is deemed desirable, as is often in the wake of an election, the newspaper is used to summon all citizens residing outside the village to return home. Here we have one such declaration, in which a particular village, Sungratse, Senso Mundang, calls upon all the villagers to come back to the village, including a threat for those who do not come, who will invite, according to the declaration, strict disciplinary action. And they are called back to deliberate the collective vote of the village. The political resolution adopted during the Senso Mundang proceedings is deemed final, and those who try to go against it risk to be condemned as traitors and to be sentenced under customary law. Put differently, the political opinion of the village majority supersedes those of individual voters, who, even if they ideologically or otherwise disagree with the selected village candidate, are nevertheless expected to cast their votes for him. As in the case of the traditional aristocrats, there are precedents to this voting strategy adopted among the Aunaga. In the past, the Aunaga polity has been depicted by colonial officers as the most intricate, multi-layered and complex political system among all Naga polities. It consisted, as it still does, of a number of councils, ranked hierarchically and based on age groups, with one such age group taking the lead for a set period of time. Unlike the Konyak and the Suminaga, there are no hereditary chiefs among the Au. Instead, the control of village affairs was with the council, and for matters of importance, all councillors, called tatars, met and deliberated. These tatars were elders who represented various clans and kindred for fixed periods of time. They were to rule over the village, upholding the common good, with non-councillors expected to submit to their authority. This body of village councillors was assisted by a range of subsidiary bodies made up of junior age groups, who would, in time, rise up to become councillors themselves. Unlike the position of Konyak Ang or Sumi chief, whose authority could last for many years, usually a lifetime, the position of a councillor was not permanent but temporary. And after a designated period of time, all the members of the council will change. Today, our Naga villages continue to be organized into councils, although the introduction of the state has introduced new arenas and institutions through which non-councillors can now assert power of their village, at times competing with the traditional authorities. Despite this occasional tussle between modern and traditional constellations of authority, the dispositions of the traditional Naga polity appears to have reconstituted itself in the sphere of electoral politics, with councillors assuming a leading role in adjudicating the collective vote of the village. Among the Naga, this often results in the selection of a village consensus candidate. And here we have one such example. The Nokpu Naga village declared, as resolved in its general meeting held in Nokpu, Senzo Mungdang hereby declares the support of the candidature of, and then the particular candidature, Benyong Liba, in the forthcoming State General Assembly elections. And then there comes a usual threat, which is part of almost every declaration of support. Any person found to be defying the decision made by the Nokpu Senzo Mungdang shall be dealt with accordingly. And accordingly, of course, is pleasantly left unspecified. Here we have another example. Merangkong, also an Naga village, declared, Merangkong Senzo Mungdang in a general meeting unanimously resolved to extend full support to the independent candidate for the forthcoming Legislative Assembly elections. It was further resolved, and here we have the threat again, heavy penalty and strict action will be imposed against any citizen of Merangkong who acts against the aforesaid resolution. Here, yet another example from the Naga village of Longmisa, where again the citizen body of the village unanimously supports a particular candidate. Violation of this order will beget appropriate punishment to him. This model can also walk the opposite way around, as we see in this declaration of support, with the village resolving not to give any vote to a particular candidate. Here it says that a particular Tatar, a particular body, passed a decision that not a single vote will be voted in favor of the Congress candidate. This model does not apply to the Naga alone. A Chang Naga village, a Chang is a neighboring tribe, also publicly endorsed a particular candidate and subsequently promised, and I would like you to have a look at, I think, the one to the third, the second paragraph, the last line, which states, that the village council is fully responsible for bringing the absolute majority. Now, going against a village resolution can have dramatic consequences, as evidently happened in Yangzitong village. Here, the village apex body announced the expulsion of 5 of its villagers for a duration of 6 years for publishing a newspaper rejoinder against the selected village consensus candidate. The village body justified the decision to expel them by stating, and I quote, "Any electoral resolutions are issued in the interest of citizens and not to some persons or a handful of people. As such, a press statement issued by few individuals has directly insulted the Surupunji." Surupunji here would be the village apex body. The duration of 6 years here is quite significant because it's also the punishment for the customary punishment for homicide. In constituencies where the village consensus model is in vogue, democratic politics is less about election than it is about selection. And voting is not so much an individual exercise as it denotes collective action, with each village in a way turning into a single vote, which a candidate can either win or lose in its entirety. Hence, to get elected, a successful candidate must seek the support of a number of village councils, Putumenden, with the backing of the village apex body, the Sensumundang. In this model, large villages assume larger powers as their collective vote can instantly put a candidate ahead in the polls. This has led to at least 2 Naga villages to join hands by combining their collective vote, and of course against announcing this in the newspaper. The Mopun Shuket and Sangrutse villages announced that they, in a joint session, this is the declaration of support in front of you, resolved to jointly declare their support to the Congress candidate for the forthcoming state assembly election. This support to the Congress candidate, this declaration further read, it is informed to all the citizens of both the villages to abide by this joint declaration. As most villages declare their village consensus candidate months or weeks before the actual elections, the outcome of the state legislative elections among the Naga is often already known, and this is the precise outcome before the first ballot is cast. This brings us to the third model, which is the clan model. This model is perhaps most prominent among the Lota Naga, although the rhetoric of clan unity and clan-wise electoral support is also prominent amongst various other Naga tribes. In this model, the locus of electoral politics does not reside in the traditional aristocrats or in village councillors, but in the clan elders. As each Lota clan generally has members across Lota villages, preponderating numerically in some and constituting a minority in others, Lota electoral politics is more of an inter-village affair compared to the first 2 models. The clan model suggests that electoral politics is predominantly a tussle between competing clans, with each clan uniting behind a particular candidate, subsequently trying to convince other clans to align with it. In a recent study, Ovum, himself a Lota Naga, argues that, and I quote, every serious treatment of Lota politics finds clan as the most important determinant in patterns of political life, unquote. Clan thinking, he continues, quote, dominates, and the question of clan numerical strength always arises, unquote. In principle, the clan model implies that each Lota clan selects a political candidate amongst its members, or alternatively, declares its collective vote to a particular candidate belonging to another clan. On the face of it, this model suggests that compared to smaller clans, larger clans have more opportunities to push one of its members into the assembly. While this holds true as a general principle, no single clan carries enough votes to do so alone, and clan members often live in different constituencies, thus weakening their collective voting power. As a result, every clan and candidate must seek alliances with other clans in order to win the election. In this model, the most effective tactic of a political party to thwart another party's candidate is to try and set up a rival candidate in his clan, so potentially splitting the candidate's vote bank. Why clans should be so central to Lota electoral politics is perhaps a little more difficult to discern compared to the first 2 models. However, its relative importance might well relate to the Lota's traditional landholding system, about which the colonial administrator G.P. Mills remarked, quote, compared to other Naga tribes, a very large proportion of the land in the Lota country is clan land, which is held in common by all members of that particular clan in the village. Every year, the members of a clan in a Lota village meet and apportion out the land, which each is to cut that year. Strangely enough, this delicate operation never seems to result in a quarrel, unquote. Seen from this angle, the primacy of clan among the Lota directly related to the primacy of agriculture and its clan-based land ownership pattern, a traditional disposition towards a clan-based social organization, which now appears to have been reasserted into the democratic arena. And we will now see that again through a number of declarations of support. The Nguli clan came out with a public declaration informing that a general meeting of the Ngulitse Ekum, the All Nguli Union, was held in Yantamo village and attended by more than 2,000 Ngulis, clansmen representing all the villages. During this meeting, they resolved to select a certain veteran Nguli politician as the official candidate from the Nguli's clansmen. The public declaration further qualified, and I think this is quite interesting, that although the Nguli Ekung did not want to, quote, infringe on the exercise of democratic rights by any individual, unquote, they had, quote, blessed and endorsed the candidate of the veteran politician, then adding that no individual member is above the clan organization, and that any violation of its resolution may compel the Ekung to take measures as per their customary norms and practices. Even if a public declaration is not under the banner of a single clan, the clan remains the unit of measurement, as the following declaration shows. Here we see that 23 households of a particular clan, the Patton clan, 50 households of another clan, the Gikon clan, 21 households of the Nguli clan, and 48 households of the Nguli clan from a different village, all expressed or declared their votes prior to the election. The key here really being that the unit of voting is measured by the clan. Two other newspaper declarations coming from the Lota area read, the Any clan of Old Changsu village with 25 households declare unconditional support to the MPF candidate. And the other one, 34 households under Tsoku clan of Pangti village have unanimously decided to support a particular candidate. Where clan unity during electoral politics is actively pursued, it is often more an ideal rather than an actual reality. In the period preceding the election, numerous clan declarations, rejoinders, and re-rejoinders emerged in the newspapers, with clan representatives disputing the resolutions adopted by their clan leaders, or with a clan in a certain village promising its collective clan vote to a different candidate than their clansmen from a neighboring village. To illustrate, in one village, 8 members of the Ezum clan questioned, using of course the medium of the newspaper, the declaration of support published by their village council chairperson, who was a member of the Ezum clan, accusing him of spreading false propaganda, cheap propaganda. Okay, this is the rejoinder. Apologies if it is not very clear. This brings us to the fourth and the final model, which is the household model. This model is most clearly practiced by the Angami and Chakasang Naga tribes. Here, traditional aristocrats are absent, where village councillors and clan leaders have little or no influence over the voting behavior of ordinary villagers. Instead, individual and household deliberation is more pronounced, and social pressure to vote collectively, except in incidental cases, absent. Comparatively, among the Naga people, the Angami and Chakasang tribes appear to come closest to the elevated democratic principles of free, fair, and autonomous individual deliberation. Although it must be instantly qualified that this so-called individual deliberation often culminates into a household decision, and that it's only on rare occasions that members of the same household cast their votes differently. Shame is spoken of a household in which different members cast their votes for different candidates, and this is compared to the breakdown of the family, even to divorce. In the household model, individual voting might, on polling day, be substituted by village council order into a system of household voting, in which the head of the household is empowered to cast the votes of all his household members. The Angami and Chakasang Naga have a marked democratic archaeology, a feature British officers wrote about with a sense of admiration. About the Angami Naga, John Butler wrote, quote, "Every man follows the dictates of his own will, a form of the purest democracy, which it is very difficult to conceive of as existing even for a single day. And yet, that it does exist here is an undeniable fact." Hutton, in turn, defined the Angami as a debating society, with the authority of village leaders, if it existed in the first place, being nominal. Their orders, I quote him, "are obeyed so far only as they accord with the wishes and convenience of the community, unquote. What Butler termed as the purest democracy and Hutton called the debating society was a reality more akin to the ideal polity for Socrates and Aristotle, with a philosophically minded and a virtuous responsible for the decision-making process. Among the Angami and Chakasang, it was usually the elders, warriors, and wealthy who deliberated decisions, commonly bearing women, the physically feeble, and the village poor from equal participation. That said, the traditional polity of the Angami and Chakasang was, on the whole, less hierarchical, people less inclined to obey to authority, and this more egalitarian disposition now appears to show itself in the kind of public declarations of support that filter from the Angami and Chakasang area. Here, they are not signed by a king or a chief, by the convener or president of a village apex body, or by the president of a clan union. Instead, they are signed by a long list of individuals, often representing a household. So for them, usually these declarations become very lengthy and also quite expensive. So the Congress Committee of Meluri, inhabited predominantly by the Pochuri Naga, who were formerly part of the Eastern Angami and Chakasang, declared a total of 72 households, and all the names of those households are mentioned here, hereby resign from the NPF party and joined the ANC party. The statement was indeed undersigned by the heads of 72 households, stretching the declaration of support into an elongated column. In other instances, a single person deems it desirable to publicly declare his alliance, like a former candidate of the RGD, who wrote, "Since the party, the RGD, is not in a position to come to power even in the near future, I have decided to join Indian National Congress, INC." In most cases, however, it is households, cross-cutting villages and clan which are the units of measurement in a newspaper declaration. Another previous RGD party worker also resigned and publicly declared that he had done so along with 31 households to support the Indian National Congress candidate. And another declared, "I, Nikilo Funo, from the president of the Kesakeno unit, the youth wing, and my followers resigned from my post and primary membership of the Congress and joined the NPF." In the household model, every head of the household becomes a political player in its own right, and occasionally confusion arises about a person's political alliance. When 3 persons from Futsaro town found their name mentioned in the newspaper among those who had resigned from the Congress candidate, they instantly wrote a rejoinder, condemning the false declaration made and asserting that, quote, "we have not resigned." In this model of electoral politics, kitchen politics, not meant in the conventional gendered sense of household decisions, but as an electoral strategy in which candidates and his party workers visit house to attract voters, is the main electoral strategy. Every person, every household needs to be convinced personally, allotted time and effort to. And while securing the support of a prominent village or clan leader might certainly benefit the candidate's local standing, it hardly suffices in securing majority support. It is this individuality, coupled by the highly personalized nature of kitchen politics, which renders electoral politics in the constituencies in which the household model is in vogue a very intensive and lengthy affair, often commencing many months before the scheduled date of the elections. Now, the third narrative I presented today, the vernacularization of politics, can be variously analyzed, critiqued, and deconstructed. But what I think these declarations of support reveal is that Naga tribes are not the passive recipients, but the repositories and enactors of their own particular versions of democracy, remolding its institutions and principles into their own traditional polities. It shows how different Naga tribes, instead of adjusting themselves to modern democratic ideals, adjusted democracy to themselves. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I suppose we can, there you are, yes. There's quite a lot that's been happening in the chat while you were talking, because there's so many details that are clear. So I will, so why don't we just start with that? Piers had a question. He was really the first one who dug into this issue, I think. How are the people, this is in the village council model, right? How is any person found to be defying the collective decision? How are they found out? I mean, please raise your hands. Now is the time to line up for the questions.
In Nagaland, the general idea is if you don't declare your vote, it amounts to not voting at all, which relates to the kind of politics of patronage, and that is very pervasive. But yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, they cannot reasonably find out. But if they would find out, then the threat is clearly indicated. So it becomes a customary.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Michael, then Dilip, and then we can return to some of these questions in the chat.
Okay, this is a really interesting paper. Thank you so much for this. I have just, I think, two small questions that came to mind. The first is, where's the Election Commission in all of this? Some of these declarations of support obviously come with explicit threats of censure for those who don't vote accordingly. And so I'm wondering what the relationship is of the Election Commission to these elections, to state and to parliamentary elections, and how that relationship might have changed over time as well. And the second question is, why English language newspapers? I mean, it's not entirely clear to me who the target audience of these declarations of support is in a way. Is it primarily to the party? It seems like this would be a strange place if the primarily target was the public. But I was wondering a little bit more about why newspapers, who are the different types of audiences that these newspapers are being geared to, and why newspapers as a means of communication in this instance. And thank you so much for a rich talk.
The second question is fairly easy to answer because English is the state language in Nagaland. So all the newspapers are in English, actually, right? Now, the question why are they using these declarations of support? I think it has two functions. The first function is to kind of influence the electoral outputs. With a big village or a particular powerful traditional king would speak out his support for a particular candidate, that can have some kind of a domino effect. So candidates themselves insist on villages and clans and traditional aristocrats to declare their political position prior to the election. The second is for after the election. After the election, there's always this gap, of course, between the politicians who promise, who make certain kind of offers to villagers, to clans, and what they actually do after getting into office. But by publicly declaring that they have supported a particular candidate, they in a way forcing the candidate later, right, to show his appreciation. So it works, I think, in numerous ways. In terms of the election commission, both the election commission as well as the church is very powerful in Nagaland. They have all this kind of campaigns. They put on banners and posters, one man, one vote, and all of that. But on election day, all of those are simply overruled. I was carrying out fieldwork in a village where there was household voting during the 2013 election. And this village is known to have a lot of connections with the underground. And partly because of that, the election commission had sent in the army. So the whole village was kind of surrounded by the army. They were also next to the polling booths, and people were standing in front of them with 5, 6, 7, 8 voting slips, right? So for about an hour or so, no voting took place because there was a tussle between the village chairperson and the army official. But in the end, the village chairperson simply won the debate. He said, this is our village, here we decide how we play democracy. This is not your duty. Your duty is simply to maintain law and order. And if you allow us to vote the way we do, we assure you that there will be law and order. So everyone will have done their duty perfectly fine. And in the end, the army official and the election commissioner was also called to the ground. They accepted the kind of agreement made and things went accordingly.
So there are two questions that piggyback onto Michael's, and then Dilip will ask his. So Lisa Mitchell is asking, what are the types of announcements appear in newspapers? And Lipika is saying the following. She is writing, the declarations in newspapers are fascinating, but I wonder if the mode of communication might have undergone a change from then till now. Are such declarations now also made in social media and WhatsApp?
Okay. What was the first question? Sorry.
The first question was Lisa Mitchell's, and she's asking, what are the types of announcements appear in newspapers?
Okay.
Those political announcements, not marriage.
Yes. So,
actually, both political and non-political. I'm trying to get a sense of the ecosystem of other announcements.
What follows by the declarations of support is declarations of gratitude, in which the particular politicians also write, in which they thank a particular clan, they thank a particular village, they thank a particular king, and in that way they are segmenting the kind of the relationship, right? Other kind of announcements would involve often chief guest. That's another a common feature in a political landscape, and it would mention what the chief guest has donated to a particular village or a particular organization or particular kind of jubilees that are being celebrated. Regarding the second question, whether other mediums are being used, yes, the medium is not the most important element here. It is who's signing it, on whose behalf is it being circulated. So in the case of the cognac, if it is authenticated that the message comes from the traditional king, it doesn't really matter what is the medium. And we do see that social media is also being increasingly used.
Dilip, please. Dilip, turn on your microphone, please. Dilip has vanished.
Yeah.
Are you there?
Am I audible now?
Yes, now.
Okay. Thanks, Jelle, for that really interesting paper, because you're also talking about space which has an English public sphere, which is interesting, right? I mean, so, but that's, so the question about these advertisements is that when you put up something which requires the community to do something or says that the community is doing something, and I wonder why this is necessary, right? One may be to indicate to the candidate, and you say that, well, candidates say thank you later, to clans and families and so on. But if there is a consensus, then why advertise it becomes a question also with regard to the three categories that you spoke about in the beginning, right? So you have the vernacularization of democracy. Before that, you have resistance and so on and so forth. So when a candidate or a set of people say, look, we are no longer voting for the NPF, we are going to vote for the INC instead, is it a signaling to the INC that, look, we require your protection, right? Or if they say that we're going to, this entire group of people is going to vote for the NPF, is it to prevent the NPF visiting violence on them for not actually voting for the NPF, right? Because in the end, we don't know who votes for whom. So what is the kind of signaling that's happening here? Because your argument is really about how this shows a certain kind of cohesion, coherence within the community, and that will break your legs if you don't follow or you'll dealt with accordingly, whatever. But there does seem to be a larger public sphere that's being addressed with all the violence and the fractions and so on and so forth. So I think that was really my question, about which I wasn't sure. What do these declarations actually mean?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I agree here. I mean, one way to look at it is in terms of consensus and in terms of the continuation of custom, but there is indeed also an element of force. And as I mentioned in the second narrative, the politics of insurgency, of counter-insurgency, right? And everyone in Naga knows that it's not really possible to win any election if you do not have some kind of backup from one of the underground factions. And different underground factions tend to support different parties. So there's also a degree of force, a degree of coercion, right? And if a particular consensus candidate is announced, then there is usually a backup and is an underground backup to kind of enforce that, not necessarily within the village, but also from outside the village. Now, at the same time, we see that there is kind of a fatigue which is setting in terms of the insurgency. Right, the insurgency in Naga, in the Naga Hills, started in the 1950s. It's now 2021, right? And for very many elections, the underground had a very large say in who would actually be in office. But what we have seen in the recent few elections, that village councils have declared that during the election season, no underground cadre can come inside the village. So they themselves are pushing them out, and they are now differentiating in a way that was not done earlier between a democratic election, which they govern, which they play according to custom, and the kind of underground Naga movement, which is a different realm. So I think what we witness at the moment is that the underground politics and the electoral politics is driving further apart than it was earlier the case. But I would definitely agree with you that I mean, one can only say so much in a small presentation. But had I focused on the first or the second narrative, right, the nuances would have been a bit different, no doubt.
Sartak has been holding his hand up patiently, but I will read out a couple of questions that go together. And I think from the things that Sartak has written in the chat, they will also go with what he's about to say. But Uday has asked the following: how does the sociology of households work alongside the competition between churches there? It seems that the everyday world of households dominates the democratic public sphere. Is that impression correct? And Shubhatri Dasgupta is asking a related question. She's saying that she can't connect to sound and video, so she's writing. She says, I would like to hear a bit more about kitchen politics in a household model. I'm particularly struck by the category household and kitchen politics here. If we can think of the household model as a link between the personal and the political, is it done to get more female votes? Are female politicians adapting to this model more? This is very reminiscent of an electoral strategy of the left front government in West Bengal, Calcutta, from the early 2000s when I was growing up, where politicians and candidates used to visit homes of voters and speak to them. So why don't can you hold on to those questions and ask Sartak, let Sartak ask his, or would you rather answer these first?
If you don't mind, maybe I can quickly answer them.
Yeah.
Get the questions. So households can belong to different churches, but that is mostly, I think, an urban phenomena. In most villages, although this is also changing, right? There's only one kind of denomination, although this is changing a bit. So in terms of kitchen politics, I think it might be important to mention here that Nagaland is the only state in India that has never ever elected a female in its assembly. Very few females stand, and none has ever come close to winning an election. I think it's now 57, 58 years. I think 21 female candidates contested and zero have won. A few years ago, there was talk about a reservation for female politicians. And this became such a huge issue. The public, they spilled on the street, and people actually died, right? Just to make sure that no woman would ever get elected into the Nagaland Assembly. So I think that the question of gender and politics is a crucial one to address. Within the household, and I during my ethnography, I stayed with the household, right? It was an open discussion around the hearth. People would talk about different politicians, and they would talk about their strengths and their weaknesses, and women did definitely take part in that. But here it was really generation that made the final call. So it was the head of the household, the oldest male, who usually exerted the highest influence on it.
Right. And Sartak, and then Kriti has got her hand up.
Right. Thank you for that fascinating presentation and for these rich insights. My question is basically on the idea of religion, because we are also seeing that the way in which BJP has been taking over large parts of the Northeast in terms of electoral power. And we have already seen how in Assam that ethno-nationalism has kind of altered the kind of political discourse that used to be, changing the identity from Assamese identity to an Hindu identity. And I was just wondering that how do we place the question of what is more important for a Naga? Is it to be a good Christian or is it to be a good Naga? Because if we understand democratization from the perspective of Christianity, it is also about being a good Christian, being more about individual, more about rational thinking, making your own voting choices. Whereas the kind of voting or the kind of democratization that we are seeing here is more of a collective decision making and collective appeals, etc. So does this clash with the idea of Christianity, or how do you place the tension between probably Christianity and the Naga identity in this kind of a democratization? So
I think that's a very important question. During election times, the churches are almost empty. So people stop going to church. And when we ask them why they do not go, they say they feel ashamed to appear in front of God, while they are engaged in practices that are deemed to be immoral. I distinctly remember one interlocutor telling me that even if Jesus Christ would come down to this village and stand for election, you would not vote for him, right? Which in a way shows the kind of moral gap there exists. The church has also been very vocal, actually, in opposition of the BJP. But the BJP has made some incursions among the Naga and in Highland, Northeast India especially. And they're aligning with indigenous movements, pre-Christian movements, which have become, in a way, co-opted, or they are trying to co-opt. I mean, Akotong Longkomer is doing fascinating work about this. But also we have to think away the BJP itself is vernacularizing in Highland, Northeast India. And during the last election in Meghalaya, one of the slogans of the BJP was that if you elect us into power, we will bring down the beef price, which is, of course, quite a statement to make, but it was very public. They would actually in public say that bringing down the beef price was one of their objectives.
Yeah.
Kriti.
So I'm going to echo everyone and thank you for a very fascinating presentation. I actually had a question around consensus. How much of a consensus is there? And how do we know there is consensus? Is it just a positioning of something as consensus? Actually, there is none. Or it's very difficult to find actually whether people vote for who they've been asked to vote because they've been asked to vote for them, or because that's who they would have voted for anyway. So I was wondering if actually this is in promising consensus or consensual voting on behalf of the clan, household, whatever scale you're working with, you're actually not really doing. It doesn't really matter whether there's consensus or not. This is not about actually it's much more about what you said later in an answer to someone. It's about eliciting a counter promise of protection, of whatever favor, what benefits, from the politician who you or the party you promise consensual voting support to. So I was wondering what you thought about that. Whether this consensus is actually it's a red herring in some ways. But the second, I was wondering was maybe I missed this in your talk. Is this strategy different when it comes to underground politics? So how do you is this how you show your support? And what is it that you're hoping to gain out of the protection? I mean, what is it that, what are you gaining out of? Do people are these similar kind of promises made to underground politics as well?
The first point, I would immediately agree. I think the word consensus is, the Naga villagers themselves use the word consensus to express this. But of course, this is not a consensus in terms of agreement. this is a decision based on all kind of hierarchies, whether they are generational, whether they are in terms of gender, whether they are in terms of wealth and capabilities. So it is presented as a consensus, right? But it is not necessarily a consensus. Although it depends on the model a bit. When it is among the AU, it's not a consensus as such, but there is a public deliberation that can go on for 1 or 2 or 3 days. I've attended these kind of meetings, and they spill over, and everyone is given a right to speak, although the sonority of a voice is not really equal, right? It depends on the kind of antecedents you have in terms of your contribution to the village, your seniority, and all of that. Underground politics, in its inception, the underground was a confederacy of tribes. So you had the Naga National Council, later you had different underground groups, and the members were tribes. Even in their constitution, it was tribal membership. So tribes could decide to be a member or not to be a member, right? Over time, this has become vastly fragmented. And today there are more than 10 factions which are competing with one another more than they are perhaps opposing the Indian state. So things have become very, very kind of muddled. What we do witness, though, is that we have all this kind of alliances, which would make it very difficult to separate the state from the underground. Right? It's in a way, the idea that they are separate entities, I mean, Mitchell would call it the state effect, right? That also really much applies in relation to underground, overground in Nagaland and most of Northeast India. So I think we should see this as a network rather than opposing entities.
Great. Now, can I ask just a quick follow-up question? Thank you. I mean, I was wondering whether, actually afterwards, after the elections, they actually go and count whether the 483 votes were actually 483 from that village, or whether and then if there's any discrepancy, how is that kind of absorbed in social life?
I have done that for quite a number of villages from where I had the evidence of a declaration. And on average, I came to roughly 15% of what villages themselves have a term for this. They call it escape votes. So escape votes are votes that do not conform to the resolutions that are being adopted. Right? So if a clan has 1,000 members, if 100 members do not follow the resolution, they are called escape votes. And they do exist.
Okay. Great, thank you.
David Gilner's got his hand up, but I'm going to insert a question from my side. I was wondering, I mean, this kind of Highland model is so reminiscent of Leachian system of alternatives, which is great. They've always got something else to go to if one doesn't work, or but of course that model has had a clash sort of right at the center, and the central thing that Leach was trying to work out is not actually convinced that he fully sort of did work that out, but at which point, how and why the models shift, right, in what circumstances. So I'm wondering if you've got 2 or more competing models in places, what's the armature of shift? And, is there any sense, can we make sense of which one tends to win out and why, or is it just a clash?
Yeah. Actually, Leach, in the end of his book, suggested that what he has been describing for Highland Burma probably also applied to the Naga, and he invited, in a way, the future scholars to investigate that. And I think it would still make for a brilliant PhD thesis. Actually, this field is still wide open. We see all this kind of in-between models as well. I have a few kind of other modules, for instance, the range model, in which villages that are located on the same hill range, they vote collectively. And what we see,
what's the word? Range model?
Yes, I mean, that's my word of it, the range model.
Mm-hmm.
But we also see very kind of creative adaptations. And in the urban centers, for instance, Dimapur, you have the self-help group model, in which self-help groups, which are financed by particular organizations, they declare in a newspaper that this self-help group is going to support this kind of candidates. So yes, there are definitely still in between models. I mean, one would expect, but that may not necessarily be the case, but one would expect that over time, because of the pressure from the church, because of the pressure of the election commission, that slowly it would go more into the form of the household module. Right? This would be the work of Mukulika Banerjee, who would argue that people are in India increasingly internalizing external ideas of liberalism, of equality, of individualism. So if that would be the case, then we would see kind of a shifting to the household individual module. But that has not yet happened. And I would also not be surprised if this would not be the case.
Okay, great, thank you. David.
Yeah, thanks very much. This is just a variation on the consensus question. Is it a consequence of your analysis, about this different ways of achieving consensus, that you don't get what you find elsewhere in South Asia? Like, that is to say, certain political families where you might have 4 brothers and one brother is, each brother is in a different political party, so that whoever wins the election, the family is always going to be connected to power.
Yeah, that's very intriguing, and that might very well be the case. I mean, parties are not really significant. I mean, people keep on shifting parties, right? There was a kind of a survey, I believe, a few years back of the Legislative Assembly in Ireland, and there were only 2 politicians, I believe, who had not changed party in their career, right? So everyone hops. I do agree there. I'm not aware, but I may not be. Maybe I simply do not know, but I'm not aware of any family dispersed across political parties. And what in the area where I did my fieldwork, this was talked about very passionately. They would make all this kind of bold statements that I would rather divorce than split up the family vote. That kind of statements were quite frequent. So I think I have to think about this a bit more, but thank you.
So if they hop parties, they hop all together? All 4 brothers?
Sorry?
If they hop parties, they do it all together?
Yes, the whole family will go. It is never one person of the family.
Gertrude Lamar had a question, what's been sitting here in the chat. What she says is that in 2017, when there was a huge resistance to the 33% reservation of women in the urban body elections, how were local debates reflected in the newspapers? Were declarations from clans or village councils used?
Yes, they were absolutely used. And there the debate was really between what is customary, what is custom, and what is seen as kind of imposed. This is a very delicate, a very kind of volatile issue in Ireland. Gertrude also, of course, she knows that better than I do. So there are 2 kind of narratives here. The one narrative is that having women politicians is seen as antithetical to custom. The other one is more in relation to the Naga movement for self-determination, in which they say who is the central government to decide who we can elect and who we cannot elect. So there are 2 kind of narratives that mutually reinforce themselves.
And earlier on, William Crawley asked, do all or most of the tribes in Nagaland accept the generic description of Naga, and does this label predate colonial times?
That's an entirely different discussion, of course, but every community is historically constructed. I mean, we can have a very long discussion on that, but if you want to have a very simple answer, no, the word Naga is not ancient. People over time came to identify as Naga. The word Naga can be, the etymology of Naga can be traced in different ways. It remains a contingent category. People join and people separate. It's always in flux. I mean, that's a standard kind of anthropological answer, I think.
But the category has been quite stable for a while, even though people come in and out.
Yes. Category emerged. I mean, the Ahom used semblances of the word, right? But it became consolidated during the colonial. It is not a local term. It's always a term that originated from the valleys surrounding it.
Mhm. Well, now that we've had a general answer about the Nagas, it seems that the hands have now subsided, and I would just like to say towards the end that it's always nice to hear that the Highlands are not as chaotic and anarchist as Jim Scott has had us believe. It's just the chaos has a slightly more complex structure
Yes,
than simple-minded Westerners tend to be used to. Well, thank you very much. It was an absolutely wonderful talk, Jelle, and we look forward to the edited volume and to further conversations.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bravo. Well done. And see you in a fortnight when we're having a roundtable discussion on millenarianism in South Asia. So stay tuned and see you all soon. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.